Now is the time for our first guest of the day. And looking at what happens in other parts of the world is always a great way to learn and react better. We saw the UAE government learning from best practices of Singapore, for example, in dealing with the COVID-19 situation. And we want to bring you the same kind of insights with our first guest. Now, Georg Chmiel is executive chairman of Juwai IQI Holdings, which owns the largest online marketplace for overseas properties in China, Juwai.com, as well as the largest project sales group in Southeast Asia, IQI Global, with more than 8,000 sales agents. He is also chairman of iCar Asia, the #1 online marketplace for Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia, and also the non-exec director of Centrepoint Alliance, one of the leading wealth management networks across Australia. Georg was previously managing director and CEO of iProperty Group, and also non-exec director of Mitula Group. And previously, he held many senior C-level positions at different real estate groups, including the REA Group. So he brings 25 years of experience in the real estate and online industry, which will be very valuable for all of us on this webinar. Now, welcome, Georg. And he will start with a presentation and sharing trends from Asia. Then we'll have opportunity to ask questions at the end. Georg, over to you.
Thank you, Ari, and good morning and good afternoon to all the listeners and viewers. Next slide. Next slide. We don't have to go over my past, so we can go straight into the presentation. I start with a few words on the next slide about what Juwai and IQI are. It's a portal and a project sales business coming together to achieve outcomes. And the outcomes we want to achieve is we want to empower Asian consumers to be global residents. Global view, so if you're somewhere in Asia and you want to buy a property for whatever reason, that's our strength. Focus is on technology, and that came particularly handy also during the current COVID situation, and quality or branded real estate content. Next slide. The focus of our business is very much, as I said, Asian consumers. And it doesn't come surprise to anyone that 45% of all residential real estate in value terms is held by Asian people and is located in Asia. Total real estate value is around $200 trillion, which is an incredible number to imagine. It's bigger than if you add up all the GDPs of all the countries in the world by a factor of 3. So that's why we're also passionate about real estate, and that's why real estate is such an attractive asset class for everyone. And of these 200 trillion, about 20 trillion transact every year. So a massive shift in value every year. Next slide. And one of the biggest buyer groups in the world, if not the biggest, are Chinese buyers. And Chinese buyers are very interested in investing overseas to diversify risk or to follow certain demands such as education or retirement. And among the top destinations for Asian buyers are certain Western countries, but predominantly also Asia, including the UAE. Core markets for all sorts of reasons. And this picture, which is here, changes obviously. It changes over time. Next slide. If we had spoken 3 years ago, in January 2017, the top inquired countries were the US, Australia, Canada, Thailand, and so on and so forth. So these are the top 10 countries. UAE was number 12 or 13. And among those top 10 countries, there's 3 countries from Asia and 7 countries from the Western world. And due to a number of factors, which is GDP, the economic development, payment infrastructure, payment restrictions or payment controls, new technologies such as WeChat and other platforms which allow a more seamless transaction of real estate, also political events such as the trade war between China and the US, or some unrest in the Hong Kong market, this picture has completely changed. So if we turn the time forward now on the next slide, 3 years later, you have suddenly 6 out of the top 10 countries from Asia, with Thailand leading, and Malaysia, Japan, Vietnam, Singapore, and Philippines. Most recently, also UAE made it among the top 10 countries, and only 4 others left from the Western market. The only place is Australia, which maintained its position. It's probably because it's almost considered part of Asia because it's so close. So quite a dramatic shift. That was January 20. That was when COVID hit, and then the world changed a bit. Next slide. The world changed a bit, that people shifted their focus very much into other markets. So as I said earlier, UAE suddenly was on the rise, and I have on the left side the provinces in China where Chinese buyers are very interested in UAE properties, and also other countries where people come to our site to search for UAE properties. So that was one effect. The other effect on the next slide was obviously a significant increase in Asian demand. So the Asian demand over the last probably 5 to 6 years had increased, and as I said earlier, more than 50% of the incoming inquiries are now clearly targeting Asian countries for migration, investment, education, and retirement and lifestyle services. And it's across various segments. The very, very rich segment, it's the affluent segment, which has 1 to 2 properties overseas to purchase. And then also it is the low investment, which are seeking for affordable property purchases, again, where certain places in Asia are very, very attractive. Next slide. If we now, next slide, go into the situation, how COVID has shaken it up. So we think of Asia as fast-growing market, very attractive property market, where it's dark blue, the darker blue, the stronger the growth. Next slide. And then suddenly we get flooded with reports and news around COVID from different banks, financial institutions, also educational institutions. Next slide. And what happens is, certainly every day we get also news about confirmed cases. And one thing is quite striking, that places like Europe or the US see a very, very strong growth. And what is quite remarkable in our time now, with the strong proliferation of information technology, social media, and so on, people immediately respond to that. So the moment the first news came out that Australia put restrictions on overseas students to return to the country, or the US saw a strong increase in COVID cases, immediately the focus shifted, which is on the other side of the slide. Next slide. One back, please. Which is, these messages started to come up, which suggest to shift the focus away from places to study, such as USA or UK, to more safe havens. And safe havens are now being measured based also on the quality of the health sector. So if you remember, not long ago, the top countries were, 6 of the top countries were Asian countries, and 4 countries were in the Western world. Now, other countries are trying to catch up. So suddenly Germany, which hasn't been on the list before due to the strong health system, got a boost. Greece got a strong boost because of visa regulations in the country, as well as US and UK, again, for the health track record. Also the Philippines, who were fairly mildly hit by COVID. So what we see is, we see shorter, sharper cycles now in the industry due to external events. Next slides. And obviously the outlook for the GDP growth, which is a driver for real estate investment, fundamentally changed. What this chart shows is the black line is the decline or expected decline in global GDP growth, so a strong decline and a very, very fast decline. And that's compared to the global financial crisis, which happened 12 years earlier. So 12 years earlier, this was a financial crisis, obviously caused by a subprime mortgage crisis and a couple of other factors, and the markets tanked. Back then, we thought the markets and the economies were tanking fairly fast, and then they were recovering. What we're seeing now is a much stronger and sharper decline. However, such a strong and sharper decline might suggest a speedier recovery. Next slide. So what we did is we thought, okay, in order to assess the impact of COVID on the real estate industry, let's ask the people at the front. Let's ask sales agents out there. And we did a survey across 60 countries. And here I give you 5 countries and the global average. So the global average is that back in early March, when COVID had just hit and was probably 3-4 weeks old in the public opinion, 82% of people out there across 60 countries were rather pessimistic. 82% was the average. However, we also noted that across those markets, Asian countries like Philippines, Malaysia, and Thailand, which are more than 68 to 74%, were below average pessimistic and slightly more optimistic. And other countries like Australia and Singapore were more pessimistic. Now, Singapore particularly because it has a high dependency on cross-border investments. And that gave us kind of something to work with, which said, actually, there is a fair bit of optimism there. Now, how do we best respond to it? Next slide. The first thing we did is obviously use the media assets we had, and we provided quality stories around the real estate markets around the world, what we were seeing, because I mean, news were full of quite graphic and negative press. So we used our PI engine to provide a bit of a balanced view on what was really happening. And because I heard earlier from Lynette, which we also saw that property prices as such hadn't really changed that much, also based on people simply not transacting as much as they had to and taking a bit more a cautious view. Next slide. The second bit we did is we rallied our 9,000 warriors, how we call them, the fighters out there in the field, and we made them ready for this new world. We shifted them rapidly into the online world. When I say rapidly into the online world, I'm talking about what happens after the advertising phase. Advertising is usually fully automated, but then the completion of sales was not. And there were a couple of measures, next slide, which we took in a very, very short period of time, within a few days. So we made virtual tours really mandatory, as outlined earlier before. We focused to a strong degree on online training. Ran also live expos, so canceled all our physical expos and ran live expos with quite amazing results, and also closed the sales online. There's not much to show on an online closed sale other than saying we are now closing our sales online. Next slide. So how has it progressed since then? Next slide. Well, as I said earlier, I mean, the outlook wasn't too good. Next slide. However, certain things happened. The first one is the fastest to respond market is usually the share market. And we got some, from mid-March onwards, quite some positive news out of China. So China, the expectation was China was on track of coming back, and obviously is now fully back in operation. So initially, high-performing industries were first up, and other industry followed suit. Next slide. Then more and more good news stories started to appear in the media. Early April for Australia, as well as obviously for UAE, more and more interest from overseas buyers, with the Chinese buyers as biggest buyer group being back online and starting to look for investment opportunities within China as well as outside of China. More and more demand came in. Next slide. And at the same time, we also saw other factors, like, for example, in Germany, which are big contributors for the GDP to really power up and fire up, such as the automotive industry. We've seen this also across other countries, even countries which are in stronger lockdowns. They have now opened up a lot of their industry and industrial production, which will mean GDP is starting to accelerate. Next slide. So while I said earlier that the GDP has dropped faster than ever before, even faster than during the Wall Street crash in 1929, as well as the share markets, there is a positive outlook. There's a very positive outlook, which was actually announced a few weeks ago by the IMF. And what the IMF have said is that while 2020 is a bit of a rough year GDP-wise for most countries, Asian countries seem to be least impacted by it and have a, let's call it, break-even to marginally below zero growth rate in 2020, and are then catching up significantly into 2021. And that's particularly important, obviously, because GDP growth and investment in real estate are very much connected. So what I want to finish with is a rather positive theme of we're in the right markets, we're in the right type of business right now. We're obviously representing the biggest asset class, and with the economy bouncing back and some countries already and others gradually coming back into business, the real estate market is deemed to recover fairly soon. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your presentation, Georg. And hopefully with UAE's great management of the situation here so far, the UAE will also be a very low impacted market overall in the mid to long run. And amazing insight there in your presentation. For example, UAE is also very strong with its healthcare system in the region. And that's something everyone targeting overseas might use in their listings. Also for everyone in the school, you can also use virtual tours that Georg mentioned with Property Finder today. And we had shared that, in the last weeks that using virtual tours actually led to a 2x increase in creating leads for you. I repeat, if you use virtual tours in your listings, that will mean you'll get 2 times more leads than otherwise.
Now it's time for our Q&A. George and Richard will stay with us for these questions as well. So my first few questions are for George. George, what measures do real estate agencies take in China, Asia, to operate under lockdown?
To operate under lockdown, I mean, the lockdown in China was slightly earlier than the lockdown for us. And the technology proliferation in these markets is slightly higher. So key thing was very much around making sure to shift as many activities as possible to online. And I do believe that these changes, which also were then mirrored in other countries, are there to stay. So for example, I mean, if I just think of property experts or physical contact with customers, I mean, they have completely shifted now to online. I do believe there will always be a bit of a personal element related to it, but so many things can be done so much more effectively and so much simpler in the online world.
Yes, that is very true. And we saw the same thing happen here in Dubai as well. Next question.
Yeah.
What would you say Chinese investors are looking for in the UAE market?
The number one reason why Chinese investors are looking for property in UAE is for investment. 83% of all people who go there are going for investment purposes. Now, when it comes to the usage, of the property, it varies a bit. Most of them see it as either holiday or for own use type of property, and a smaller percentage sees it for rental.
Okay, interesting. Next question. What could we do to make our listings, what can our clients do to make their listings more attractive to Chinese investors?
Well, I mean, first of all, make them more visible, and second of all, make them more attractive. In order for Chinese buyers, the first one, the visibility, is around using the right channels and platforms to get to Chinese buyers. As you might know, in China, there's a different technology environment or ecosystem. There's no Facebook, there's no WhatsApp, etc. So there's a firewall. In order to get to behind the firewall, it's really working with people who are in China. The second bit is think about the language barrier. I mean, many platforms these days, such as WeChat and so on, allow for quite a very high quality type of translation, but still having people available who speak the local languages and dialects is very, very powerful. And the other one is obviously focusing, also acknowledging how big the market is, and not thinking that, you know, one size fits all, or there's no one who can advertise to the whole market for everything. So you have to be really, really smart about how you go about it. You started to pinpoint where the demand is for a certain region or a certain city in the world. And then also on the attractiveness side, use design elements in your property. I mean, there's certain things which can be done if it's a property which is built or can be still modified a bit. Think about feng shui design elements as well, and use the right colors, etc., etc., etc.
Those are very good points. Thank you very much for those tips. Next question. Can a Chinese citizen transfer freely funds to a UAE bank? If yes, is there a limit on the amount?
There's a limit on the amount of $50,000 US per person to transfer. But I mean, obviously in a larger family, they can quickly get quite sizable. That's the first thing. That is for money from mainland China out. Second bit is that doesn't include debt. So debt comes on top of it, or mortgages. They are able to literally then increase the buying power of Chinese buyers.